he goes to Rome. He went to Rome twice to see if he could settle a parish that he was supposed to have, and it didn't work. He went there again to see if he could get some source of income. It didn't work. Okay, so then he comes finally to Paris in the year 1608. He's almost 30 years old at this point, and he comes to Paris empty-handed. This is the good news. This is the good news. If he came there successfully, if he had gotten to be a bishop, or if he had gotten to be an abbot, or got some other source of real income, he would have gone home and we never would have heard of him again. So the good news is he came empty-handed. And then his life starts to change. He makes good friends in Paris, and good friends that he also shares a view of things with. These good friends are spiritually oriented people that are looking for the renovation of the church in France, and they have a big influence on him. But something happens that's important. He's living with a colleague of his, a judge actually, who's from the same part of the country, and they're living together. He's not feeling well. The judge goes to work, and in the meantime, he orders some medicine from the pharmacy. Some kid brings it over, and okay, so that's all that happened. But when the judge comes home, he says, "You stole my money. The money I had in the cupboard there is gone. And who else could take it but you?" So he was accused of being a thief. And not only accused, but actually they announced it in the pulpit on 3 different Sundays that so-and-so, he's a thief. But he doesn't defend himself. See, something's happening. This is this guy who's looking for money, for benefits, and when he's called a thief, he doesn't defend himself. And you start to see why. Well, starting to resemble our Lord in his passion. He didn't defend himself either in that context. So something's starting to happen. Eventually, a few months later, the guy who took the money was the guy who brought the medicine, and he confessed to that. So here's something starting to change for Vincent. He's made these good friends. And then when Vincent's 12 years a priest, so that's 1612, somebody helps him to become a pastor. First time he's a pastor in 12 years as a priest. Goes to Clichy. It's at the present time it's in the city of Paris, but then it was outside. And he loves it there. The bishop comes by and says to him, "Hey, checking up on him," and he says to the bishop, "Listen, I'm happier than you are. I'm happier than the Pope is." Okay. And why? He says, "Because my people are so good." And I really like that story so much because it shows how easily Vincent related to the people, how much he instinctively appreciated them. And when he saw that they were good, that's what he loved them for that. And I like that so much from this point of view about Vincent. He had a great capacity to be touched by the people he was with. He was touched by their goodness and so on. So that's a very important thing. And at that point, he's sent to another family, a rich family, to be tutored to their children. Okay. Actually, he doesn't know it, but that family is going to be very helpful in his future. But at that moment, he doesn't know it. He's just following the obedience to his spiritual director. Anyway, at this point, he goes through a crisis of faith. And from like 1613 to 1617, he's full of doubts about the faith. It's very painful for him, and he wants to believe. He's trying his best to believe, but still he has all these doubts. And so, you know the story. He finally wrote out the creed and put it in his pocket here, and then he would put his hand over it when he had these doubts to try to physically signify his faith. He came out of it. It's interesting how he came out of it. But first of all, as I thought about that years ago, I started to ask myself, who was the poorest person Vincent ever met? Who was the poorest person Vincent ever met? And I decided it was himself. He was poor, not financially. He was working for a wealthy family. He was taken care of and so on like that. But he was poor in terms of being powerless. He was powerless over his desire to believe. And so 3.5 years is a long time. So I think he knew what it was to be really, really powerless. Very, very poor, but not financially, but very poor. Couldn't do what he wanted to do. Very powerless. A couple years later, I started asking myself, who was the richest person Vincent ever knew? And I came to the same conclusion. I thought it was himself. Because those two things go together. The depth of knowing our emptiness and the space to receive the mercy of God. When we don't know our emptiness and when we're full of ourselves, there's no room for the mercy of God. But when he knew how powerless he was to do what he really wanted to do, there was a great space inside himself to receive the mercy of God. So, as I see it, I think this was like a very defining moment in his life. He knew what it was to be really poor. And afterwards, the way I try to interpret that is this, that in the future, he could never look down on somebody else. He couldn't. He knew what it was to be really, really poor. He never could look down on somebody else. And it gave him a huge sympathy for poor people. And finally, how did he come out of this? He came out of it by dedicating himself for the rest of his life to the service of poor people. That was the outcome of this crisis. The decisive year for Vincent to discover his vocation was at the end of his crisis of faith. It was 1617. Two things happened in 1617. In January, he was called to the bedside of a fellow who was dying, and he heard his confession. And then this fellow told Madame de Gandhi, who was the owner of all those properties, he said, you know, if it wasn't for this confession, I would probably die in sin. And so it was a great grace for me. And Madame de Gandhi says to herself, this is one of the best people in this parish, in our properties. He's got a great reputation and so on. And he was in danger of dying in sin, according to his. She says, okay, we have to do something about preaching the gospel and helping people make confessions, make general confessions. So she says to Vincent, the feast of St. Paul is coming up, the conversion of St. Paul on the 25th of January. Would you preach a sermon on conversion and going to confession to the people in Fulville? And he said yes. So he did, and it was so effective that many people came to confession. They had to send away for a couple of Jesuit priests to come and help him hear confessions and so on. That was the first sermon of the Congregation of the Mission. No one knew it at the time. It was still going to be 8 more years before he founded the congregation, but that was the first sermon of the Congregation of the Mission. The second thing was this, that they used to reconcile families. I don't know, we don't have much documentation of how they did this. But see, in those villages, they went to villages, and in those villages it happens often enough that families have a falling out with one another. And as time goes on, they can't even remember what happened. But they just don't like this family, and they don't like that other family, and things like that. And so they spent a lot of time reconciling families. That was amazing. I mean, it's a terrific gift. I have no idea how they did that. But so reconciling families. And then the third thing was they established the confraternity of charity in that place. So 3 things, very, very important, simple, powerful. That was how the second important thing that happened in 1617 was, Vincent, after he discovered the spiritual poverty of the people, it was no longer, this is my opinion, it's an explanation, it was no longer possible for him to just spend his time teaching these 2 kids that he was a tutor to. He saw the need of the people, and so he arranged to leave the Gandhi household without telling them. If he told them, he couldn't go. So without telling them, and then they helped him to go far away over by Lyons or Lyon, where he became a pastor. And there, the story goes, and you've probably heard it, of course, that as he was starting Mass one day in August, some people came and said, hey, there's a family of 8 people not too far from here, and they're all sick and they can't help each other. And so he told the people at Mass about this, and then in the afternoon, he and a companion went out to visit that family, and they met all these women coming back who had already been out to give all kinds of help to the people. And so that's also the beginning of the confraternities of charity. He said to them, you've given them so much help today, but too much actually, but what about if we can space that out and we can organize ourselves and so on? So he helped them. You could say he organized them, but I think you can say also he helped them organize themselves. And then he came to understand that the poor people were his vocation. Poor people were his vocation, and also that the poor people were poor in 2 ways. One, spiritually poor, in terms of, they were spiritually poor in this way. There was a lack of priests. There were a lot of priests in Paris, but very few priests out in the countryside, and so on like that. So he was responding to that need, and then so he's been on a long journey already, but a couple of finishing touches, a couple of things. And the first finishing touch in 1619, when he's 38 years old, he meets Francis DeSales. And it took me a long time to understand how important that was in his life. See, Vincent, we mostly, in the past, we just talked about Vincent when he was a saint at the end of his life, But one thing about Vincent at this stage in his life at age 38, he's still not happy with himself. He's a little moody. He's a little irascible. He's not so happy with himself. And then he meets Francis DeSales. Francis DeSales was the gentlest person of his time, meek and gentle, but he was immensely human, very human. And in Vincent's world, up until that point, being human and being holy were opposed. Being human was a danger to being holy. That's where the temptations lived. And he found in Francis DeSales that you could be human and holy at the same time. And thank God for that discovery for him, but also we've discovered that in our own day, among ourselves, that that God made us human, and He wants us to be, holiness is like the perfection of being human, but you can be human and holy at the same time. That Vincent discovers that, which is a huge, huge gift for him. So DeSales becomes so important for his whole life after that. And for example, when people are starting to want to learn how to pray, what does he do? He tells them, read Introduction to the Devout Life, written by Francis DeSales. And then also, he's the other treatise on the love of God. So Francis DeSales was such an immense influence on him. And another way to say that is that he could see that in Francis DeSales, he could see the human face of God. Humanity, being human and being holy, they went together. And he didn't know that up until that time. So there's a great, great grace in his life, meeting Francis DeSales. And for ourselves too, and we can look at our own lives and see some of the people we've met that have been transformative, that really gave us the hope to become everything we could be, And then he makes a retreat for gentleness, following on from DeSales. And then the final thing is this: 1623. He's scheduled to go down to Bordeaux, which is not far from his home in the south of France, and give a retreat to the galley slaves. And then he says he hasn't been home for a long time. And he says to himself, I think it's a chance to go home. But he says, I've seen other priests get involved with their families, and then they lose their focus and they lose their zeal and so on. They get taken up with family affairs. So he's wondering. So he tells his friends, and they tell him, listen, don't worry, you'll be fine. So he goes home and he spends 10 days there with them. He loves every minute of it. His mom and dad have died already, but he meets again his brothers and sisters, and then their families and all that. So after 10 days, they have mass, and he leaves. But after he leaves, he starts to weep, and he's really broken up for the next 3 months. And what's that about? Well, you could say that it's just that he missed his family so much or something. Anyway, here's what I think it was about. So I have to own this. It's what I think it was about. But I think he failed his family. They gave him a mission. His mission was to go and get some benefits and to support the family. And he tried. He tried but failed. Failed, you can say failed, didn't succeed. Okay, but there was a sense of failure. And that finally he faced that in his life. That he faced that sense of failure, and that's what the tears were about. And then finally he says, the Lord gave me the peace to let that go, and he did. So, and I think that actually can happen to us too sometimes, right? We're carrying something that's unresolved from the past, and it's if we are and we get it resolved, it's a huge grace, and it's freeing and everything else to go forward with. So I think that happened to Vincent. Then one more thing. Then he goes to, in 1624, he's 44 years old at this point, goes to his, he's not exactly a spiritual director, but his wise man. There was a guy by the name of André Duval. He was a professor at the university, he's a priest and all that. Goes to him, and he says, listen, Madame de Gandhi, for whom I've been working and all this wonderful woman, family, she's sick and she's about to die soon. And she's asked me, since that sermon in 1617 on the feast of St. Paul, the conversion of St. Paul, she's asked me to go and find a community that will preach the missions on her properties every 5 years. And he says, I failed to do it. I mean, I went to the Jesuits. They say we have colleges in the cities. Went to the Franciscans, went to other people. Nobody. Okay. He says, so he's telling his spiritual director or his wise man, he's telling him, so you know what happened. I started doing it with the help of Monsieur Portail and some other people who would help me. And he says, you have to know, of course you know that the Lord has blessed it. And so on like this. And then Portail says, and then Duval says to him, he says, he says, it's very clear what the will of God is for you. He says that he will accept the money and found the congregation of the mission. So that's how that happened. If you believe, as we do, that God is here now, that he's here in people, circumstances, and events, okay, it takes a certain level of freedom to understand that. If we don't have freedom, we're going to impose our own solution on the data. And it's only if we have a real sense of gospel freedom that we will actually understand what God is saying to us in the people, the events, and the circumstances. So it took me a long time to see that his journey involved a journey to freedom. Freedom to actually listen to what God is saying to him in the people, the circumstances, and the events. So that's his journey. A journey to the poor people, to freedom, free at last, and then to say it in the words that resonate with the Daughters of Charity, given to God for God's poor. That was his journey. So it's a long journey to freedom. And one final comment, it's a long journey to the mystery of the poor. And we talk about the poor, we can do that on some other occasion perhaps, but we talk about the poor, if I'm writing it out, I make a capital M, mystery of the poor, meaning the poor as God sees them. Finally, at the heart of our vocation and all the people that we know that are inspired by the spirit of St. Vincent and their love for the poor, your love for the poor, it's the poor, not as sociologists see them, not as economists see them, not as whatever else sees them, but as God sees them. To have the eyes and the heart of Abba, to have the eyes and heart of Jesus. So thank you very much.